Joining us to analyze today's headlines is Chenjerai Kumanyika, Assistant Professor of Communication Studies at Clemson University. Hi, Chenjerai.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for joining us. In a surprise move, Egypt's highest court of appeals has just revived charges against former dictator Hosni Mubarak for the 2011 killings of protesters. Mubarak had been freed last year after being tried for the same crime and had all charges dropped. The new trial will begin this November, and once it concludes, it cannot be appealed. Mass public outrage over Mubarak's earlier acquittal has fueled the disillusionment many Egyptians feel in the post-revolution era. Meanwhile, current President Abdel Fattah Al-Sisi, who has been likened to Mubarak for his repressive rule, has faced protests on an international arena recently during a Berlin meeting with German Chancellor Angela Merkel yesterday. Al-Sisi faced hundreds of demonstrators calling him a dictator. One woman called him a murderer during the press conference that followed. Al-Sisi claimed that he was working under, quote, difficult circumstances. Well, Chenjerai, is there hope that Egyptians won't let the current state of affairs continue for too long so that their revolution against Mubarak was not in vain?
Yes, I think, when you look at this conflict, most news agencies will invite us to see two sides of the problem. On one hand, they'll condemn the dictatorship of Mubarak, the Islamic extremism of Morsi, and the excessive use of the death penalty and other violence by the current president, Al-Sisi. And then in this frame, they try to paint the governance structures of the West, with Obama and Merkel and others that are pressuring these governments as the humane alternative. What I think we have to remember is that the U.S. supported Mubarak during some of the most vicious parts of his regime, supplying him with both aid and weapons. And it was the people of Egypt, not the U.S., who led the uprising to remove Mubarak. And also, we have to look closely at the words of Merkel. She's concerned about Egypt because of the security of Germany and all of Europe, quoting her. So we should therefore look at the ways that Western imperialist power works closely together with extreme Islam and dictatorships to repress democratic progress in the Middle East.
Good point. And then Ukraine continues to remain volatile with a new wave of violence that has claimed nearly 24 lives this week alone. A ceasefire agreed upon earlier this year in Minsk between the Ukrainian government and pro-Russian rebels has been completely eviscerated. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko issued a dire warning in the capital, Kiev, today of a, quote, colossal threat of the resumption of large-scale hostilities by Russian and terrorist forces, end of quote. He added, quote, Ukraine's military should be ready for a new offensive by the enemy, as well as a full-scale invasion along the entire border with the Russian Federation. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov blamed Ukraine for the latest upsurge in violence. International monitors with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe say they have observed the movement of a large amount of heavy weapons in the rebel-controlled area of Donetsk. So far, 8,000 people have been killed since the conflict began over a year ago. Well, Chenjerai, how volatile is this situation? Media are reporting that no one really expects a full-scale war, but clearly Ukraine's president seems to be very worried.
Yes, well, I think, we have to zoom out a little bit. Putin has made his intentions clear in Ukraine. And this escalation is worrisome because as national leaders like Putin intensify their military solutions and military efforts, it's citizens who wind up paying the price. One example of this is Putin's recent declaration that military deaths are state secrets. And so many have worried that, if we can't report military deaths, for example, in eastern Ukraine, we're not going to really see the accurate costs of war. On the U.S. side, we've seen John McCain advocate for arming Ukrainians, and even some recent things that, we don't have all the details yet, but have to do with what George Soros is even recommending, that, are really not based, again, in a concern for Ukrainians, but more so, as John McCain put it, trying to counter a perception that the United States is weak.
And finally, the New York Times and CBS have just released a new poll about wealth inequality, labor rights, and international trade in the U.S. Not surprisingly, a majority of Americans see inequality as a huge problem and want the government to actively intervene. Specifically, 68% of those polled say they want an increase in taxes on millionaires, and 71% say the federal minimum wage needs to rise from $7.25 an hour to $10.10 an hour. On workers' rights, the numbers are even higher, with 80% wanting employers to offer paid leave for new parents and caregivers, and 85% wanting paid sick leave. On international trade, however, most respondents just didn't know enough about the Trans-Pacific Partnership to answer the questions. That ignorance is part of what what activists organizing against the TPP are denouncing, with the House of Representatives expected to take up the issue of fast-track authority for President Obama to negotiate the massive international trade deal. Secrecy abounds. Leaked portions of the TPP show that workers' rights and the environment are at great risk. Well, Chenjerai, do you think the New York Times and CBS will actually see the results of this poll as an indication that they need to do a better job on exposing the TPP?
I hope so. We don't really know enough about the TPP, but what we know about this fast track legislation is that it seems to be setting a disturbing precedent for how trade legislation is going to be governed going forward. I mean, Bernie Sanders talks about the effects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership on American workers. And then others have talked about that it potentially will threaten net neutrality, but we haven't heard as much about how it will affect developing countries. And it seems that it's likely to raise drug prices in the developing world, according to Oxfam and Stiglitz and others. So here we're seeing the true face of the Obama administration and his willingness to cooperate with Republicans to push through legislation that goes against what the people in the country are increasingly demanding.
Chenjerai, thank you as always for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you.
Chenjerai Kumanyika is an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.